This is a lecture, History 1302. This lecture encompasses the challenge to the Bible, the changes in Christianity, and the effects upon the church in the late 19th century. One of the things that is important to understand about the changes of the church, has been discussed in an earlier lecture, is that the church suffered in a larger social sense, but especially amongst elites, that it was coming into a declining influence. The role of the pastor, the role of the clergy, though still prominent in American life, was especially amongst elite and Tony circles, was not nearly as respected as it had been in years gone by, especially prior to the Civil War. One of the facets that's going to start to erode the confidence of the church and erode the confidence of one of the most important facets of Christianity, and that is its Bible, has to do with what might be called German higher criticism, and also we'll talk about this more in another lecture, is the rising of Darwinism and the theory of evolution. And in fact, actually, that might be the greatest of all the challenges. But when we talk about the Christian church, especially the Protestant version of Christianity, which many and most old-line Americans were in the mid to late 19th century, the most important facet of those in the doctrines, in the practices, in the thinkings of the Christian church happened to be the Bible. The Bible, particularly, say, the Authorized Version, which is commonly known as the King James Version, was the bedrock in which the Protestantism had been birthed all the way back into the days of Martin Luther. If you remember Martin Luther from 1301, or another class, Martin Luther is the father, in a sense, of the Protestant Reformation. Then you have others like John Calvin and William Tyndale and so forth, who make it a point to get the Bible into the hands of many Christians and many people in general. So, in the 19th century, and even in the 18th century, with the rise of the Enlightenment, there had been some chipping away at the authority of the Bible. But in the main, the Bible itself had been taken to be authoritative and was in the main correct, especially in the early understanding of in the beginning, as Genesis 1:1 starts out. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Because, with maybe you can argue and dither about Jonah and the whale or this or that, but the fact of the matter is that for the most part, people in the 19th century looked at the Bible and said, you know what, it is accurate. In the pre-Civil War era, particularly, and in the 18th century and going backwards, there were many people who thought that the Bible was very literally correct. Not just a collection of stories and metaphors and orthodoxies and doctrines, but literally a record-keeping of how things were. So it was not just a religious document, the Bible, especially the Protestant version. The reason being, by the way, you're saying, well, what about the Catholics? Does the Catholic Church value the Bible? Yes, it does. It has its own Bible. It's a slightly different version. It's got several books that the Protestants have rejected. But the Catholic Church has never put the same emphasis on the authority of the Bible in an isolated sense that the Protestant movement has. In the Protestant movement, you're going to have what's called the sola scriptura, which means the Scriptures alone or the Bible alone. The Catholics never support that. So just to let you know, but still, the Bible is authoritative in the Catholic Church as well. But for the main part, most folks who read the Bible or understood the Bible, or at least understood enough to be to believe it, thought that the Bible historically was more or less accurate. It was 100% accurate in some cases. Some would go that far. Inerrant, infallible might be another way to say it. But by the time we get to the late 19th century, that, especially amongst elite circles, now back again to that university class, back into that academy territory, back into the lawyerly class, the leadership class, there were a good many of individuals who looked at the Bible, not all, but a good many individuals who look at the Bible and say, you know what, it's still right, but it may not be authoritative in the complete sense that we thought years ago. This is true amongst the elites. It's true amongst even some within denominations you wouldn't think this be an issue. Here's an example. A man's name is Crawford Toy, T-O-Y. Crawford Toy was a soldier in the Confederate Army in the Civil War. And Crawford Toy is going to fight and see a great deal of violence. He will be a soldier. He's not rear echelon stuff. But at the same time, he gets through the war. He survives the war. And then he surrenders to the call of ministry. And as he's going through seminary, he eventually, as a Baptist, so I'm clear about this, he's a Baptist, he goes to Germany and studies under what I've used in a previous lecture, the term German higher criticism. One of the things German higher criticism sought to do was to erode and to, as a solvent might erode a disease or whatever. That's probably too strong of an analogy. But certainly it sought to apply scientific expertise, higher reason, criticism, and so forth, and to look at the Bible with a searching eye, a skeptical eye, and what comes out is basically through German higher criticism, the theology schools of Germany and so forth, is an understanding and a belief that the Bible wasn't quite what it was made up to be. That, say, for example, the book of Isaiah was written not by the prophet Isaiah, but by multiple individuals. That perhaps the books of Moses, meaning the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, those books were not written by Moses, but by a collection of individuals. And on I can go. That the Bible itself wasn't quite as unified and as authoritative as it once was. Crawford Toy studied under that. And the fact of the matter is that Crawford Toy is going to come back to the United States after having studied in Germany in those Berlin and German theology departments. He'll come back and he'll establish himself as one of the premier lecturers at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. However, that all to say, though, is that as time goes on, by the 1880s, Crawford Toy, who was a likable man and liked by many, he was not the sourpuss who threw cold water everywhere and said this is not good and was opposed to the Bible, in a sense that he was a jaded man. Crawford Toy never got past the fact, I think, of twofold. One, the carnage and the wreckage of the Civil War, but he also, having gone through the theological school of the Germans, he comes back with and begins to say, I just simply don't believe the Bible to be what I have to believe to teach at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. For example, it has to do with the authorship of the books of the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that they weren't written by Moses, and that was something that could get you fired. And it eventually got him relieved from his professorial duties at Southern Seminary. And again, I want to make this clear, Southern Seminary was not excited about running him off. It was not one of those, we got the heretic moments. Many individuals lamented the fact that he was leaving, but it was against their doctrines and policies. My point to tell you the story about Crawford Toy is that this sort of doubt, this doubt of the Bible, the doubt of the authority of the Bible and who wrote it and so on and what it means, is going to be one of the bigger issues in the slow receding of the church's authority in American society. And it has to do beyond just the stories of Crawford Toy or the elite. The thing is that for those who are thoroughgoing and honest churchmen, they look at the Bible and they say, you know what, it's a good book and it has good moral teachings. The issue for many of them was, what about the miracles? Say, taking the miracles you see in the Old Testament, for an example of the parting of the Red Sea, how does that be answered? Another example would be, say, the stopping of time, the gates of Jericho, the stopping of the stopping of the sky, or perhaps in the New Testament, the miracles of Jesus. But by the way, miracles have been in doubt for years, to be fair about it. But it took on an added urgency, and that has to get back to the issue, I think, of Darwin. We'll come back to that in another lecture further and explore that more. But for those in the church who are going to say, okay, I have doubts about the literal authority and the literal truthfulness of the Bible. Not that the Bible's a lie when I use the word truthful, but it's not literally true in every facet. It's not a 6-day creation. It is not true that Jonah was swallowed up by a whale. It was not true, etc., and so forth. Many of those churchmen start looking around and casting about for a different way, and perhaps a way to update the church, to modernize the church, to answer a pathway for the church to answer modernity and to answer science is what about Christianity for the 19th and now coming 20th century? What should we do? And in the late 19th century, you're going to see ministers rise up who are going to take a lesser and lesser view of the Bible as an authoritative document in the book, and bring up and rise up and be very influential in prominent denominations. And they're going to promote variations of what is known as the social gospel. Some of you in your readings have already come across the social gospel. The social gospel basically means is that in olden times, say prior to the Civil War and what's known as the Second Great Awakening, there was a very heavy emphasis on preaching, a very heavy emphasis on conversion, the mourner's bench or the mourner's row, the repenter's bench. Those are all the camp meetings, the conversion experiences, all those great revivals of the pre-Civil War, and even during the Civil War era. Those things, especially amongst certain elements of the church, are going to be played down, and the idea of the social gospel raised up. That conversion perhaps isn't nearly as important as social uplift. That conversion, in the sense that you have if you're not familiar with this, you didn't grow up in a Pentecostal or a Baptist or non-denominational or whatever, where they have what in the olden times was an altar call, where you say, essentially, the preacher preaches a sermon, and in a sense, this is the classic example. He asked, those of you, in a sense, he'll ask, any of you who wish to profess faith in Jesus, come here and receive that faith, and receive new life. That's a classic example. It's changed over the years, but that's it. These social gospelers would say that's not necessary. Perhaps some would go so far as to say there's a universal salvation, that God wants none to perish, but all will be saved and all will be called home. Some might say, no, that can't be true. The worst axe murderer, not them, not Hitler, of course, and on from there. But the social gospel in the main would say we need to uplift society, and we need to help the poor and the penniless. We need to do more and preach less, in a sense. We need to let our preaching be done by our actions. In a sense that you would, in Hell's Kitchen, you would have a man who would, let's see, make sure I get his name just right, Walter Rauschenbusch, was I guess you could call him a missionary to Hell's Kitchen. Hell's Kitchen was one of the worst and most grimy and unpleasant, unhealthful, wicked places in all of New York City. And there he was preaching and serving and helping the poor. In a sense, when you talk about the Salvation Army has a clear gospel preaching message to it. But when William Booth and the Salvation Army get going, there is clearly a social uplift of the food and the help and the helping out to the least fortunate. So, in a sense, what you do is you drive up and you emphasize the charity aspects of helping, and you downplay the preaching. Those were big things. But you also see this too in ministries of prominent mainline Protestants. Again, this is really going to affect the Protestant church, not nearly to the effect of the Catholic church. Yes, you have social gospel priests and believers, or adherents rather, in the Catholic church, but because of the organization of Catholicism and especially the leadership of the papacy at the time period, it was never as pronounced in the 19th century as what you see in the 20th century. The 20th century, say, I would argue, in the Catholic Church, the social gospel really takes on the most radical form, say, in Central America with what's known as liberation theology. But that's to chase a rabbit I really don't need to get into. But anyways, the thing is that some of the most prominent men who are going to be promoters of the social gospel, this helping of the poor and the meek and the weak at the expense of preaching, or when they do preach, by the way, these men do preach, but they will preach not a hellfire and brimstone like Jonathan Edwards and the Sinners in the Hands of the Angry God, or perhaps other Puritans of the long and distant past, but they preach much more of an uplifting message, something a less watery version of, say, Joel Osteen out of Houston. Some of you are familiar with Osteen and his big church down there. So anyways, when we talk about the help of these ministers, here's a name for you: Henry Ward Beecher. Henry Ward Beecher is a son of a very prominent set of family members. Beecher, memory serves, is about to say congregational. But Henry Ward Beecher's father was a very famous preacher named Lyman Beecher, and Henry Ward grew up in a conservative Bible-believing house, which is part of the story. Is that Lyman Beecher did not doubt the authority of the Bible. In Henry Ward's family is going to be steeped in Bible learning, and in fact, actually, you probably know his sister far more than you know Henry Ward. His sister's name is Harriet Beecher Stowe. She of the Uncle Tom's Cabin. Very famous set of family and sisters and daughters and so forth and so forth. But Henry Ward Beecher is going to be one of the most prominent megachurch, to use our terms, megachurch pastors in the late 19th century America. He's going to get caught up in a sex scandal, and it doesn't cost him his job. At the same time, thousands and thousands of people will come to him to hear him preach, and he does quite well. And then there was another one, David Swing, who's a Presbyterian, who also grew up in a conservative household, an inerrant, authoritative, scriptural household. Yet David Swing will become one of the Presbyterians who helps turn the denomination Presbyterianism away from its traditional moors out of Princeton and or say the Scottish Presbyterians that we've talked about in 1301 to more of the Presbyterians that you might see today at a PCUSA, Presbyterian Church in the United States of America denomination. Emphasis on social uplift, downplaying of miracles, preaching hellfire and brimstone. And even the Episcopalian minister, Phillips Brooks, goes that same way. And so all these three men are going to be prominent features and persons in late 19th century Protestant Christianity in the mainline denominations. Who are going to push the social gospel and to push the uplift and charity and preach not hellfire, but preach heaven, and almost to exclusion of the hellfire. You can obviously go, I would argue, now this is my personal aside, you can go too far in both ways. But at the same time, that all to say, though, is that you're going to see this new style of preaching. And it is very much a direct issue and a direct argument and fight within the Protestant movement. One of the individuals that's going to be a very prime againster, as a countryman might say, againer of these social gospel would be J. Gresham Machen. J. Gresham Machen grows up in the late 19th and early 20th century. He dies in about 1935-36. At the outset, people like Machen were opposed to the social gospel, and at the outset, say in the Presbyterian Church, they were able to drive some of the liberals out. But by the time you get to the 1920s and 30s, it is J. Gresham Machen who himself is driven out, and the liberals win. They take over the denomination. They take over the leadership. In the Presbyterian Church, for example, it's true in other denominations as well, and they take over the seminaries. And so if you teach the preachers a certain way, you're going to get a certain type of preacher, frankly. Should not be surprised there. But one of the things that you see in some of the more thoughtful social gospel individuals is that when you start to remove the doctrines and you start to downplay the doctrines and you start to tamp down on the old creeds, some of you grew up in creedal type churches. An example would be the Nicene Creed, or you say a catechism like the Westminster Catechism or something of that nature. When you start to downplay those tenets of Christianity, take the life of Jesus for an example. The fact of the matter is Jesus born of a virgin, Jesus resurrecting on the third day, dying on the cross, the healing of the sick, walking on water, and on and on and on and on. The life of Jesus is full of miracles. And when you start to take that away, and you start to take away the idea that there could be torment, eternal torment for those who don't believe in Jesus, and this would be you start to lose the exclusivity of Christianity, especially in this case Protestant Christianity. A lot of those thoughtful social gospelers got to thinking, like, you've perhaps lost Christianity. And so there was this uneasy conscience amongst the social gospelers that they felt, not all this is true, some went headlong into it, and never were the same again. Walter Rauschenbusch, however, would basically say that basically, yeah, if you start losing too much of the doctrines and the creeds and the old standards, well, you lose Christianity. And so what do you get? Well, you get a Christianity without a Christ, in a sense. And so it's one of the real fights within the church. Again, you may say, well, how does this impact individuals? How does it impact denominations? Well, it impacts denominations because you see in the Presbyterian Church, which is in its time one of the bigger denominations in the whole United States, you're going to see preachers who do not believe or at least publicly affirm any of the old doctrines and standards. Or to say it a little differently, some would say, yeah, I believe in the Westminster Confession, however, I don't believe it to be binding. Or they'll say, yes, I believe this is recorded in the Bible, but no, it doesn't mean exactly what it says. There's real turmoil within the church, and it's going to have a profound impact in the United States in the pews. And it has to do, again, with this overall theme of mine of in this course is, why do you start to see, or how do you start to see the recession of the church in the prominence of public life? Again, some of you come from communities and your families where the church is still very prominent. I am not saying the church is dead. I am saying, however, from where it was in 1830 to where it is in 2020, nearly 200 years, 190 years, I guess, the fact of the matter is the church is receding and has receded. As I've said in previous lectures, many of you maybe have never gone to the pastor and asked a question of advice on an issue for this or for that. Anyways, the fact of the matter is that when we talk about this social gospel, the social gospel is going to be found in examples such as the Salvation Army. Now, that would be an example, the most prominent example. Some of you got that question. Y'all got that question on that last exam, but that issue there. But the real thing that's going to help chip away at the authority of the church has to be the issue of Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin and those who agreed with him wholly, those who agreed with him partially, Charles Darwin and his theories of evolution and on the origin of species and so forth and so on. If you were to say to me, as I'd draw to a close here in this brief little lecture, if you were to say to me, what was it that was perhaps the greatest threat to the church and is the greatest issue, it has to be Charles Darwin. And in 1859, if you were to pin me down, what was the year that it all kind of began? 1 year before the American Civil War got underway. Technically, I guess you could say it began in 1861, but South Carolina seceded in 1860. The fact of the matter is that in 1859, Charles Darwin publishes his book on the origin of species, and it was that book, along with the Civil War, that is going to, I think, begin that great erosion of faith in the United States and arguably in Europe as well in its own manner. So we explore these heavy and weighty issues, and then eventually we'll turn back to other less perhaps important issues. But before long, it is important to note that times are changing, even if sometimes it looks like they're not changing at all. Because sometimes when we've talked about the Gilded Age, it just seems like this drab and dreary onward discussion about businesses and what have you. But it's always important to remember, those folks who are being educated in the high schools and the universities and the colleges in 1880 or 2020, especially in certain colleges and in certain universities, will be the preachers and the lawyers and the leaders and the presidents in about 10 to 20 to 30 years, the span of a lifetime. So just think about it this way. For those of you watching this, those who would say social uplift, social gospel, doing more, a larger role for the government, scientific management, and so on, those who are learning those principles in the 1880s will be your progressives by 1900, 1910, and 1920. An example of prominent names like Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and beyond. So, anyways, that's where we stop. We'll have another lecture in a minute.